Welcome to part 2 of Camera and Computer Arts. As photography continued to develop from the 19th to the 20th century, artists who were also photographers continued to look into ways of working with the medium and how to really revolutionize the medium. One great revolutionary was the artist named Alfred Stieglitz. Now, besides being a great artist in his own right, he was married to the painter Georgia O'Keeffe, and he really helped to make her famous by promoting her. And actually, if you know the whole story, he took several photos of her partially draped, and these created quite a firestorm, quite it was an outrage, and it made her pretty famous. So that's part of what Alfred Stieglitz did with his photography. But he believed in something early on. He was really working with photography as a viable art form, apart from painting. But after a while, he kind of gave up on this, and he developed what he called straight photography, which would be capturing scenes of life and recording them in a very realistic manner. This first image that we're looking at by Stieglitz, it does have an art quality to it. It looks posed. I think it is. But it's a beautiful composition. It's a very spectacular posed photograph. And here's another later image of Stieglitz's. This is a street scene in New York, and this is probably some of my favorite work by this artist because you can really see what it was like in New York City in the early 20th century, where there's still mostly horses and, rainy street, muddy street. It's just really fun to see that and visualize what that must have been like back then, about 100 years ago. So another very important artist that is an artist photographer is someone that may be familiar to some of you. And this was the artist Ansel Adams. Unlike Alfred Stieglitz, Ansel Adams believed in using the tools at hand, using his camera, his length of exposure, his processes in the darkroom to really develop and enhance what he was trying to say with his images. He also created these large-scale prints and became quite famous. Another thing that Ansel Adams did was he raised awareness of the beauty of the West for the entire country. He worked quite often in Yosemite National Park, but this is from the Tetons. It's the Tetons and the Snake River, and is a beautiful picture of Ansel Adams. Now let's look at a totally different way of dealing with photographs, and that is looking at how photographs have permeated society. And one person who did that pretty well is named Hannah Höch. Now, she was from the Dada movement. And I can predict that some of you are looking at this and thinking, well, that's ridiculous. Well, of course, some of you think it's probably pretty cool. Here's the deal. The Dada movement, or the Dadaists, came of age during World War I and the aftermath of World War I. And the origin of this movement is in Europe. So consider people that are young people, late teens, 20s, maybe early 30s, and their world is totally torn apart by war. So this is the war, World War I, where we had the trenches, and the war was followed by influenza epidemic, which literally killed millions of people. And, cities were destroyed, ancient historic places reduced to rubble in this very destructive war. So it caused these artists to rebel, to really rebel against the status quo in the arts, and to create this radical art that part of it was that they didn't really even care if they sold it. Now, Hannah Höch was a big one who was part of this movement, and another very important one was the artist Man Ray. Now, this image is one that is an actual photograph, but many of Man Ray's photographs weren't photographs at all. He would take objects into his darkroom and expose them and make these kind of Dada expressions that are really quite modern and quite interesting. Okay, so now let's move on forward to a more modern artist who's playing with art photography in a new way. This is the artist Cindy Sherman, and we have a video about her this week. She's fascinating. Even if you don't really care for her work, perhaps when you hear the story of it, it might make more sense. Ever since she was an art student way back in her late teens, I think probably 25 years ago, this artist would record herself in a variety of settings, disguises, vignettes as the one that we see here. And she's making a statement on how we project, how we think we learn about people from how we see them. So one of the things that she's done is she'll dress up as like a very old, wrinkled, highly made up socialite. Okay? And then she'll dress up maybe as a street person. And she'll photograph herself in both of these settings in order to sort of maybe allow us all to look more at how we project onto others and onto ourselves. And that's sort of what this week's discussion question is about. So she's actually a very well-known artist. She had a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which is about as high as you can get in the arts. She had that, I think, 2 years ago. So she has reached a real high level with her art and her explorations of how we humans see ourselves and how a photograph or an image can affect our response to someone. Really fascinating work. So I want you all to read about censorship on page 209. And the person profiled in 209 is Mapplethorpe, and he was very controversial. He became sort of the poster boy of people talking about how terrible the arts funding was, their choices. And that's a really valid point. But when we think about censorship, that's one hot topic. You know, a few years ago, there was a billboard up in Harrison, Arkansas, near which is near where I teach. It was a racially offensive billboard, no question about it. And yet it had been purchased by a private group, and you couldn't really, it didn't have a slur. It wasn't profanity. It was just an offensive slogan. And many people were really offended by this. But I raise it in class as saying, okay, so should this come down? Where do you draw the line? At what point does something cross the line of being simply offensive to being something that's worthy of being censored? And that's a really valuable thing to look at. Now, just to finish that story, it was wonderful. What happened is the churches in the area got together and created a counter billboard about loving your neighbor and all different neighbors being, about tolerance. And the original billboard that was offensive, someone bought the plot and took the whole billboard down. But it doesn't, it's just more of a continuum where people are always wanting to express themselves freely. That's what we do in this country. And yet sometimes that expression is highly offensive to groups or to others. And so I always want to propose people, to students, to look at this and consider this, because at what point do you say that is no longer acceptable to put in the public viewing? Even though I was highly offended by this billboard, I wasn't sure about that. I wanted them to take it down. But could they legally take it down? I don't think so. All right, we'll move on. Let's talk about the photographer. We're just going to touch on the last two. And this guy is Andreas Gursky. What he does is he basically makes statements about industrialism, like this. I mean, you kind of get the point here, don't you? And if you look in the book at that huge office building, you get the same point about humans almost like parts of vast machines. And then, and he does this with a lot of digital manipulation to create his scenes. Although this one, I'm not sure. He might have made it be a bigger room than it actually is through digital manipulation. The other guy I want to look at is Thomas Ruff, he actually scans stuff he finds on the internet and then turns that into images. Okay, let's move on to film. In your book, on page 211, is one of the most important series of photographs of all time. And that's the horse galloping. Before these photographs, nobody knew that horses' legs all came up off the ground when they galloped. In fact, the guy who started Stanford University, Leland Stanford, in the 1880s, he had a $25,000 bet saying whether or not horses' legs all came up off the ground when they were galloping. And as you can see, if you look at page 211, yeah, they do. So this guy, Leland Stanford, he commissioned the guy who took these pictures and the pictures in your textbook, a guy named Edward Muybridge. And Muybridge took the series of pictures, proved it, and actually then that was the birth of film. Because if we watch these images, if they're projected quickly in front of us, very quickly, then our mind will retain each image as the next one appears, and we see it as it being in motion rather than a string of images. It's fascinating, but it's just how the human mind works. So once film was invented, of course there were some other things that needed to happen. Thomas Edison had to add some things. Cellulose film was invented, but eventually we got to film. Now here we have one of the earliest cartoons. And this is by the guy, who is this by? This is Winsor McCay, and it's Gertie the dinosaur. And what's cool about Gertie is she came from a cartoon, but she was the first cartoon character who really had, she was the first film cartoon character who really had a life of her own, so to speak. So there's a whole process, there's a whole series of early film's development, from the introduction of sound to the subject matter to its great influence in society. And now as we move on into video and then into CDs and computer, which allows us to watch so many films. All films are available now, and we've lost sort of the ritual of going to the movie theater. Now, I want you to read through page 214 through 217 in your textbook to get an overview of film. And we're just going to touch on some of the greats. Bruce Newman actually, is considered to be a revolutionary in early video. And now his work might seem to be quite simple to us. But he really took the whole idea of videography as an art form and pushed it in many different experimental ways. Another really important early photographer is Nam June Paik, and there's some work of his in the book, but this is one that I find quite interesting. It's an actual cello. It's called television cello, and I just think that's pretty cool. What this artist does is he looks at video and its effect on us and kind of exaggerates that so that we maybe notice. Actually, that's, I think, one of the most important things, is to notice the effects that images have on us so that we're not just unconsciously affected, and we can choose what images we would like to take in. Another artist that was very important in the development of early videography was Peter Campus, and he kind of pushed the limits of the medium, again, in a way that might look kind of primitive to us, but for its time, it was really powerful and revolutionary work. Now, one woman artist who has done a lot of important work, the Iranian-born artist Shirin Nishat. Now, she's taken the internet and videography, and she's Iranian-born, and she's made statements about her culture in a way that are quite powerful and quite impactful. One more that I'd like to look at is the artist Cao Fei. And again, we have a video of hers in the films this week. Now, this is actually a real-life still, but Cao Fei she took the notion of Second Life and creating an avatar to a whole new level. This artist created a whole beautiful sort of empire for herself within Second Life, and then sought to bring this to this life by having people dress up and go out in their characters and become their avatars and on like that. So whether or not this appeals to you, it's interesting to see just how far we've come from that early Paris street scene to these folks hanging out in the field with their avatar costumes on, running through the flowers. Hey, why not? Well, photography does continue to develop, and I feel it's probably an art form that many of you use in your lives and like to play with. So on that note, I encourage you to be really creative as you consider your final project and how you might possibly use photography for that. Of course, that's only one of the options. The main point with the final project is to maybe push yourself creatively a little bit. So this will complete our audio lecture on camera and computer arts. And once again, thanks for listening.